So this is the so-called ayahuasca effect, and it's a very ingenious thing. Chemists and biochemists, pharmacologists, by ingenious reasoning, had said in the end of the 1960s, when we first learned by chemical analysis of actual potions that DMT occurred in the potion, and when it had already been published that large doses of DMT taken orally exerted no effect, we were able to propose this, but no one, it was accepted widely, but no one took the time or trouble to test it. And so that was first done by myself in Mexico and a couple of other colleagues working independently here in Europe, and also in the United States. And so this information is all published, and I didn't invent the term ayahuasca analogues, but Dennis McKenna rather did in his thesis work in Canada. But he was talking about just something in a test tube in the lab to use as a standard in pharmacological assays. And that was just a mixture of beta-carbolines, which reflected their relative proportions in Banisteriopsis stem. So besides harmony, you also have harmaline and tetrahydroharmony. But in the actual potion, the important compound is harmony. And in the case of the seeds, which are used, pecan harmon seeds, as a substitute outside of the Amazon, it is rather harmaline that is the important compound, which is more potent. So I call this anahuasca, or ayahuasca analog. And for my experiments, I did these in little gelatin capsules with pure alkaloids in crystalline form, weighed and put into the capsule and swallowed. And this I call pharmahuasca, and it's a pharmaceutical analog of it. Some people think this is reductionistic, perhaps so. But it's the only way to, if you want to back up a theory like this that says, okay, it's a synergy with one compound inhibiting an enzyme such that the other compound can be absorbed without being broken down by metabolism. Well, this is the only way to find out. You can't see the effect in animals, and so you have to use human beings. And the only the only ethical way to do this is by human self-experimentation, because in this case, for me, there's no danger to such an experiment, but for society at large, except for there are legal issues involved. And so to ask someone as a volunteer, even paid and even supposedly fully informed, to ingest something that one hasn't ingested oneself is ipso facto unethical. And this used to be standard, just an understood protocol that no one even needed to talk about in the scientific world. For example, when Albert Niemann in Göttingen isolated cocaine in 1859, he first put it on his tongue, they made a solution and put that in his eye, and because we didn't depend so much on fancy machinery to characterize compounds, people would talk about their taste, their smell, how it felt on their skin or their tongue or some particular membrane. And this was common procedure up until about 1950, as I believe John Lilly has written about in one of his early books. And then suddenly it became seen as something like an out-of-bounds Frankenstein sort of experiment for someone in the lab to test the alkaloid on himself. Well, that's not objective. We're supposedly subjectively examining things. Well, of course, I won't go into that, but I think the subjectivity is a pretension of scientists. But in any case, what we're studying here is the subjective human experience of inebriation. And so the only experiments that are really valid are subjective ones, because that's what we're looking at, something inside of people, not something that you can measure so easily in a machine or by some model based on levels in the blood or very arcane derivations of that. All right, let me just say a few words about the linguistics of this. Words are a very important source of information about the past, perhaps one of the most important. We like things to be as solid as possible in science, especially in chemistry, which is the science of matter itself. But so we dig up bones and artifacts, but unfortunately you get a very spotty record both in time and space. And so you may have very solid evidence, relatively speaking, about dating a certain piece of pottery with a certain type of design on it, or a bone by a hearth remains, which can be somewhat logically and pretty reliably dated. But these will be widespread, and you'll have big gaps in the record, and huge gaps all over the place. And so then theorizing comes in, there's all kinds kinds of room for argumentation, and this keeps academicians busy and it's largely its function. But if you look at the words, on the other hand, we still, of course, many languages are dying even as we speak, but there are many more words around than there are bones and fragments of pottery. And so you take something like the word ayahuasca, for example. Well, it's said that that means the liana of the soul, or the liana of the dead, or the liana of the spirits. Huasca pretty clearly does mean liana, or a vine-type plant that grows in the jungle, a climber. It is a type of epiphyte that grows on top of another plant, only for support. But it seems like this word is Quechua, and the Quechua language comes from the Andes, and it's a plant that's not found in that ecosystem now, and we don't know for how long, but it seems like more likely just since the contact with Europeans, or shortly before that, have Quechua speakers lived in the Amazon. So unfortunately, most people know about the names of plants that are used in connection with ayahuasca beverages by Quechua names, such as chacruna, which means mate, complement, or mixture, and that refers to Psychotria viridis, this DMT-containing leaf that's added in potions. Well, that's another Quechua name. And so ayahuasca means the supposedly the vine of the soul. Now, this word probably only goes back about 300 years. That's when it first appears in the record. It could go back somewhat farther than that, but it's very unlikely that it's a pre-Columbian term, simply because of ecological separation. The people that spoke that language didn't live where this grew, nor do we have evidence that they used it in those times, or knew about it even. They may have had some contact with it, however, because they tried to conquer tribes that lived in the Piedemonte, or the interface between the Andes and the Amazonian lowlands, and mostly without success. These were highland, very hardy highland people, they couldn't live there. They weren't adapted to it. They didn't have the cultural adaptation. So, in Colombia and in Brazil, in this interface of northwestern Amazonia, which involves bits of Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil. It's more commonly known as yahe, and sometimes as ka'api, more to the east. The scientific name comes from a word, an indigenous word from this area of the Chicano peoples, and we call it gapi or kapi, and they use it in also, and I'll explain how they use it. So we fixate on this particular recipe between one element, a monoamine oxidase inhibiting stem of Banisteriopsis caapi, and one leaf, or 2 or 3 leaves, all of which contain DMT, and they're mixed together. And I've seen many times in catalogs and articles, ayahuasca is a tea made from 2 plants. Well, this is extremely reductionistic, because it's been reported and reliably documented by plant samples that there are about 100 different plants that are mixed with Banisteriopsis. And Banisteriopsis itself is mixed with a dozen of other plant preparations which are not called ayahuasca, and in which it is clearly an additive and not a principal plant. And so that's problem 1. Problem 2 is, I think, and this is my opinion, that this potion, this modern aqueous mixture of beaten stems of the Banisteriopsis liana and the leaves, especially if that is cooked in a pot, which many people think is the common way, and it's not. It's at least as commonly just mashed with the fingers in cold water without any heating, and drunk right away.